Scot Faulkner.
Over the years, I've been involved in designing and leading strategic transformation. This has included working with presidential transitions, reforming the U.S. House of Representatives, re-engineering the ANZ Bank, which is the fourth largest bank in Asia, working with the European Parliament and European Commission to expand into the old Eastern Europe and Warsaw Pact countries, and more recently working with the Customs and Border Protection on expanding their training operations, and with Dubai Ports and Customs, where we had the challenge of balancing port operations and efficiency with security in a very dangerous part of the world. In every case, what made success happen was first and foremost making sure everybody was in the room, all your stakeholders, all your key players, because they have to buy into the vision, they have to buy into the change process. A vision that is so vivid that you can taste it, you can feel it, you can touch it, you can see it, but most importantly, you can measure it. Because the changes that we're looking for are going to be tangible, they need to be timely, but also we want to make them sustainable. So what's to be done about governing the federal government? It's one thing to offer a clear choice to the voters during the campaign cycle. But what happens if that campaign cycle never ends? That's what's going on right now. Everything is politicized. Everything is polarized to the point where even facts are polarized. Nothing is getting done. Think for a minute about a great film, Lawrence of Arabia. T.H. Lawrence and his Bedouin army blow up trains. They do it real well. They take Damascus, they can't govern. That's exactly what the cautionary tale about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Everyone's become experts at blowing up trains, but nobody seems to know how to govern anymore. What's worse, everybody seems to be running away from common ground, because common ground is now viewed as the domain of the weak. So what do we do about our current budget crisis? It's been around now for many years. Last summer, they came up with this grand plan to come up with how do we cut X amount of dollars over the next 10 years. The problem is nobody is really serious about it. Everybody in Congress wants to pass legislation. Everyone in Congress wants to be Santa Claus and distribute money. Nobody wants to spend time actually figuring out where the money goes. And that's the problem. Close to 30% of our entire federal budget can be viewed as waste, fraud, or abuse, or just simply ineffectively used. That's what the Government Accountability Office and the Inspector Generals in the different agencies show us on a daily basis. Just last week, they showed $115 billion in improper payments going out the door last year. And people were declaring victory because that was down from $150 billion the year before. In the real world, $115 billion going out the door to improperly documented or undocumented recipients is not cause for celebration. That's cause for alarm bells going off. They live in a parallel world, and we need to do something about it.
And heading the news from Planet America this week, the race for the White House continues. Now, somebody who's very glad that Newt Gingrich isn't winning is a fellow by the name of Scot Faulkner, who Gingrich himself appointed the Chief Administrative Officer of Congress after the Republican sweep of the 1994 midterm elections. That was the one that ushered in the so-called contract with America. But according to Faulkner, Newt's personality flaws and personal infidelities undermined his political achievements. He says that despite this week's results, though, it is unlikely that Newt Gingrich is going to go quietly into the night. Scot Faulkner spoke to us earlier from Washington, D.C. You know Newt Gingrich better than most people. What do you think he's thinking this week?
I think he thinks he won.
Not a lot of contact with the reality is what you're suggesting about Newt, hey?
Yeah, for Newt, it's always a parallel universe.
Like, does Newt Gingrich still fancy a scenario where he becomes the Republican nominee and President of the United States?
In his world, he still thinks there's a path that way.
What would that path look like, given that he can't get to that 1,144 delegates that he needs to become the nominee at the convention?
I think what he thinks is that somehow his moon base and other ideas are going to catch fire out there in the heartland, catch fire in New York and California and Texas that are still big states coming up, and somehow Santorum will stumble, Romney will stumble, and everyone will turn to him as the messiah of the Republican Party and conservative movement.
I'm sensing you might not agree with him there, Scott, but just to move on there.
No.
Yeah. Just as someone who knows Newt quite well, I've just observing him over the last 4 or 5 years. He used to be pro cap and trade. Now he's completely against all global warming and melioration whatsoever. He used to be for the healthcare reform. Now he's against it. It seems to me that almost the only thing he's been constant on for the last 5 or 6 years is a desire to say the word frankly, profoundly, and fundamentally. I'm just wondering, is there any ideology that you can see that Newt has maintained over the last 10 years or so?
No. I mean, the key is that Newt, it's all about Newt and the way his mind functions. He wakes up every morning and it's a new world. It's really the opposite of Groundhog Day. He literally reinvents himself and the world around him every day, and sometimes even during the day.
You've picked up his habit of saying literally as well, I can see, Scott. What sort of a president, if it were to happen, if the parallel universe of Newt Gingrich were to converge with our own and he were to become the nominee and president, what kind of president would he be?
A very dangerous one, because that same world view where basically what he thinks is what's real, even if it is completely based on nothing. Imagine that dealing with an international crisis. Imagine that dealing with even a national crisis. It could be a very frightening world with Newt Gingrich in the White House.
Basically, most members, when they get up there, their primary purpose is to muscle their way to the trough, not for their constituents, but for themselves. The rest, who do want change, simply don't know how to do it. They know how to do management by press release. They know how to announce initiatives. They know how to form task forces. They know how to announce studies. They know how to propose legislation. But that's all they know how to do. They don't know how to actually make it happen. And in many cases, outcomes is not what they want, because when an issue is in play, the money is in play, the press releases are in play. Solutions aren't something that garner the kinds of headlines that crises do.
Why do we have a civics crisis in America? When I was CAO of the House, I met with George White many times. He was the architect of the Capitol. And the two of us in the summer of '96 planned the National Capitol Visitor Center. And this is a little bit about crowd control. This is still years before 9/11 and security concerns. The main reason for the National Capitol Visitor Center were that the tour guides of the Capitol were tired of answering tourist questions about, no, the Oval Office is not here, and also trying to explain why there were two wings to the building. And so we started to realize that whether it was tourists from Virginia or Iowa or California, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of our federal government, our Republican democracy, the three branches of government, and something had to be done. So that was my first aha moment. So when Richard asked me to come on board to help ramp up the initiative and be kind of the implementer for his great vision, I hesitated maybe a nanosecond.
This is a multi-layered approach. It's not just putting civics in the schools. What are some of the broad areas, and we'll let Richard make the announcements?
Well, the key is that when you think about what makes a viable culture, a civic culture here in America or any country, it's an interweaving of many different threads. It is the K through 12 pipeline, how you prepare young people to take their place as engaged, effective citizens. The second is, how do you engage the popular culture? How do you have people learn about our country in many different ways, especially through the arts? And how do you give people a sense of grounding, a sense of place in terms of preservation of history, but a sense of place in terms of where we fit in history and how one thing leads to another, leads to another. And those are the three initiatives we're going to be announcing tonight. The whole underpinnings of a civic culture, especially ours, is to be able to give public space to those we disagree with. And that means that civility is not about being wussy, it is not about avoiding conflict, it's about managing conflict in a positive way, in a productive way. I mean, some of the most destructive years of this democracy, this Republican democracy, has been the last 20, because you have such a partisan prism that has poisoned this country, where you have people who, on each side of the political spectrum, demonize the other side and do not look across the aisle and say, that's a good idea, I'll be for it. Or my party screwed up on something and I'm going to call them out on it. Where we're tracking with this is to look at how do we get young people engaged. Again, going back to the legacy of Horace Mann, how do we create an effective, engaged citizenry? How do we get young people to register to vote? How do we get them to turn out and vote? How do we get people to hold power accountable, to not only attend those hearings but ask questions at those hearings? To read those GAO reports, to demand of their legislators, and especially as we come into the cycle coming up here in the 2012 elections, demand of candidates that they answer the question. And if they don't answer the question the first time, ask it again and again and again. Because that's what has allowed a lot of these people to get away with, in essence, a murder of our civic culture.
Mr. Richard Dreyfuss, everyone, and Scot Faulkner here on the New Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.